So we were talking about the US-New Zealand relationship, and I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the impact of the breakup of the ANZUS Treaty, where you see things leading now, and also relatedly the New Zealand-Australian relationship as a result of because AUKUS and everything that's been talked about now seems to at least have some background in the longer years and the issues of trust, the issues of what you really mean by defence relationships, partnerships, what New Zealand's supposed to get out of them, what New Zealand's supposed to give.
Put into them, yes. We don't always think of that side much. Yep, okay.
So, using the ANZUS breakup as a springboard, where does the US relationship go after that? How does it get back on keel with Washington and the Wellington declarations? And where do you see it heading?
In a way, the first thing we learned from the breakup was that we can't manage our foreign relationships adequately without a comfortable relationship with the United States. Not necessarily an alliance, just a comfortable relationship. And indeed, ironically, Helen Clark really spent her entire administration trying to rebuild that comfortable relationship with some success. I do remember a Deputy Secretary of Defence in Washington saying to me at the height of the crisis, we'll rebuild the relationship because both of us have to. But he said, sadly, from my point of view, the element of trust will be very hard to rebuild. And I think that's right. So I think we have rebuilt a working relationship because we had no option otherwise than to do it. We found out the hard way by picking a quarrel and then finding we needed to retrace part of our steps. All of this happened during the long peace, when you could think your foreign policy could be whatever you wanted it to be, because there was no real issues that threatened you. It may be, although who knows, that period is coming to a close, in which case I think the old realities of foreign policy will reassert themselves for New Zealand as for Australia, and that is, we are both from our history and our language and our geography bound together. A threat to one is inescapably a threat to the other, despite the Tasman between us. But secondly, that even collectively we do not have the strength to deal with a major threat, a Soviet Union or China or whoever it might be. We depended originally on the British. They went in 1942. We've depended ever since on the United States, and I don't think that has changed. Our feelings can come and go. There's always been quite a streak of anti-Americanism in New Zealand. Originally it was right-wing. Oh, the Yanks, they want to undermine our empire, and they talk funny, and so on. And then over time that switched to being a left-wing issue, American imperialism, much worse than Soviet imperialism and so on. So there's a lot of people that don't think much about the United States, but we haven't had a crisis. When we get a crisis like Pearl Harbor, I think we will feel that relationship as being very important. And mercifully, I think, unless obviously, I think the Americans will too. In the crisis of 1942, when we wanted more American naval ships to protect us, and the feeling in Washington was that they needed them, their reduced Pacific Fleet, to protect Hawaii, and that they might have to leave Australia and New Zealand to, quote, look after themselves. And Admiral Philip King, a rusty, crusty old character, famous for his anti-Anglophile tendencies. He thought the Britishers talked funny, wore the wrong helmets and did everything wrong. But he said at the meeting, we can't do that. They're our brothers. We have to stand by them. And they did. And I feel that we may have weakened the trust that the Americans have in our reliability, but I don't think we've weakened that sense of, solidarity isn't the right word, but of a relationship. We shall see.
What about the Australians? Do the Australians trust us?
Our relationship with Australia has never been all that easy. On Anzac Day we talk about the Anzac relationship and so on, but in practice it's always been more talked about than felt. We fell out with them in the Second World War because we wouldn't bring our division home from the desert, and they wanted us in Papua New Guinea. And 2 or 3 times the Australian Commander-in-Chief of their forces wrote to the Prime Minister to say, in our defence planning in future, we can't rely on the New Zealanders. And I think that's always been under the surface. And I think at the moment, the Australians and we have different priorities. For them, security is still a big worry. And they would like to think that our spending on defence and our ability to reinforce that security with naval vessels, Air Force fighters and so on would be very valuable and would acknowledge the strategic codependence that we share. New Zealanders have not really often seen it that way, and when the government in 2000 abolished our combat air force, I think for the Australians that was a real blow. I think they decided that we won't make a fuss with New Zealand, they are what they are, but we won't do them any favours either. So we find that when we want to ask about deportation of people, nobody listens because the Australians feel we're not paying our side of the bill. And I think that will be true for some time to come.
But regardless of that, there has been suggestions that New Zealand joins AUKUS.
New Zealand
joins AUKUS.
Yeah.
Or at least from our perspective, we keep talking about joining AUKUS, whether we've been invited or not.
Yeah, I'm not really all up on that. I can't see the point of our joining AUKUS. We don't spend anything on defence. We have no fighter aircraft, let alone 2 combat ships for a country surrounded by sea. I don't quite see what we would bring to AUKUS, and I think that the Australians in particular would see it more clearly than I do. But we'll see.
Andrew Little's talking, though, about having combat-ready troops. He came out with that 2 weeks ago. So is that a sea change as far as the New Zealand government, the current New Zealand government, sees things?
It's certainly more vocal. I mean, we've always, in theory, had combat-ready troops. We haven't equipped them very sophisticatedly, and we don't now exercise with the best forces that could teach us. So I don't know whether our combat-ready troops would be all that combat-ready. But when you have virtually no combat navy and no air force at all, combat air force, you're not contributing much to the general. And in things like security, it's a hard old world. You get what you put into the kitty, not what you talk about.
Can we just talk briefly about national security? So, as well as being not terribly engaged on the defence front, New Zealand's not terribly engaged in terms of thinking about things like foreign interference, cybersecurity, terrorism, things like that. You know, we see those things as, or at least have seen those things as things that happen in other countries. That requires the New Zealand public having different attitudes towards our defence, different attitudes towards threat. Do you see that there's that will go back to the sort of Cold War view of the world? Or has New Zealand always been a little naive in that regards?
Yeah, those are very good points. Looking back over what's now surprisingly a fairly long life, it seems to me that in the long period of the long peace, we have lost any sense of a threat. Ms. Clark's reference to our living in a benign strategic environment, I think reflects what a lot of people feel, that nothing's wrong, why should we be fussing, spending money that we can't afford on defence and so on. So I think over that long peace, mysteriously, we have lost any sense that the world could change and be threatening. Now, I think the world may be about to change, depends on Xi Jinping's ambitions and so on, but if it did, I think our sense of threat would certainly come back, but it's not there at the moment, and we're preaching to the choir, or rather to the empty pews, when we talk about the need to be spending more on defence. Our foreign policy is certainly hampered by our lack of defence backing. When we talk to the ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia, how important this is to us, and it is after Australia, the second most important area, but they don't see us doing anything to help maintain their security. So they just smile and say, it was jolly nice to have known you, and move on. And all of that is, I think, taken as a fact by New Zealanders at the moment. It would change if we got a real sense of a Chinese threat, but whether we do or not, I don't know. Depends what happens with Taiwan, essentially, and what our reaction would be to that. But I think human nature being what it is, sooner or later our attitudes are going to have to change, but they're going to change more slowly than Australian and Canadian and American and so on attitudes, as they did in the run-up to the Second World War. Labour government was inherently opposed to military force. It worried about the New Zealand Army, which was tiny, to under 600 people complete, but were worried, and even Savage on his deathbed worried about the military making a coup, taking over the government, which seems absurdly exaggerated, but was a fact. So accidentally they spent money on an air force, not because, because they were convinced that air battles were going to be the battles of the future, and that the Air Force was no threat to constitutional order, as they felt the Army would be. Accidentally it turned out we had rather good set of air bases and bombers when war broke out, but it was a fluke, not planning. We took a long time to grasp the Nazi threat, and the Japanese threat, and when it came, we really, I'm struck by Peter Fraser's appeal to the United States for help. We have not a single fighter aircraft in the country. History goes round in circles. It's true now today too.
Yes. Do you think that that it is naivety? Because there are obviously people in government that are writing defence white papers or national security strategies, or even MFAT's latest report, where they quite clearly see what's happening in the world as being threatening, quite clearly see that New Zealand has to take a position on it. Is it the fact that we are, as a nation, shrug off threat? Or is it the fact that we just can't make our minds up the best way to respond to threat?
Probably a bit of both. But you're right, I mean, we can all write. I write newspaper articles, and people write papers and so on. But New Zealand, to its great strength, is a democracy, and a very direct one. So no government in New Zealand will ever act on anything without being confident that it has significant and durable public support. So spending on defence, although often talked about, turns out to be less than you might have thought they were going to do. So a change in New Zealand's attitude will mean a change in public opinion. And I think that would come from a feeling of vulnerability, that we're not pulling our weight with our friends, but it's not the case at the moment.
Looking at, and I know this is something that we've talked about, but you may not want to go into lots of depth on, but this history of our intelligence agencies. So you were our...
I chaired the Intelligence Council for 10 years.
Council. Right. And I know that you've gone public on the breaking in of the Czech and Indian embassies.
I only spoke about the Czech.
The Czech.
Even then, perhaps I said more than I should have. But I thought that the former officers of the security service were themselves talking, in which case it put it in the public domain.
Right. So what I'm interested in there, we don't have an MI6. We don't have an operations side to CIA. But we do have obviously a very good intelligence gathering organisation. But the break-in into the Czech embassy implies, breaking into the Czech embassy implies that we had some sort of skills to do a break-in in those days. And I was told by somebody at GCHQ that CIA was also involved in that break-in. So clearly CIA had skills to go in and not get caught.
Yes.
But that implies that New Zealand actually does have some sort of operational ability.
There is a bit of a tendency. I think I mentioned to you about the Savinsky affair, where the Soviet ambassador Savinsky very imprudently went to Auckland to pay the Socialist Uniparty the subsidy that the Soviets gave them, and got caught. And the Russians for weeks believed that it had been an American operation. We couldn't have done anything as good as that. So perhaps there's a tendency to believe that if we do anything that works, the CIA must have been behind it. But I think there's a feeling that we really are a pack of amateurs. But we've had a security service now officially for
80 years.
80 years. So I think you've got to assume that some skill in the business has been acquired.
Yes. So on the same note, if our intelligence agency, our national security people are trying to build trust with the public in a way that the public sit up and take notice of some of the threats that we're having thrown at us, do you think that they need to come clean to some extent about their history? So we're talking about the Vegetable Club, we're talking about Bill Such, there's a number of documented stories where SIS either overreacted or tended to see Reds under the bed, right up until the present day. You could say it's an occupational hazard that you get it wrong every so often.
Well, I think it is with any covert operations.
But how do you deal with it in a mature way that gives trust back that you're doing the right thing?
Well, you've got to accept, I think, that during the Cold War, there was relentless propaganda by friends of the Soviet Union about how awful the SAS was. Those slogans, smash the SAS and so on. And more subtly, what a pack of idiots they were who didn't know the first thing about their job. So you're going to get a bad press, whether you like it or not. All my time in the Intelligence Council, I emphasised, and we kept saying publicly, we are bound by the law and we do not exceed the law. We're not a lawless organisation, we're under democratic control. Lots of times people said, oh, pull the other one, mate, I don't believe a word of what you said. It was impossible. And finally we kind of went public and published constitutions for the agencies. Up to that point, they depended on our say-so. But we didn't break the law. But I think you've got to accept that any actions that a covert organisation takes will be subject to considerable distrust and indeed attack, partly from interested people, as was the case with Friends of the Soviet Union, but partly because people who are just bothered by, they don't feel that they're getting enough assurance that we're keeping the law, and their tendency to believe that anybody in this business will happily break New Zealand law was irritated me, but it's a fact.
But, the Kim.com example, was one where we did overreach, and reasonably recently.
Intelligence problem, or was it a police problem?
Well, it was both, wasn't it? Because of surveillance. The SIS was surveilling Kim.com.
But the rather absurd arrest. Numerous, was 8 policemen or something, raided. That sort of thing was an overreaction.
The point I'm making is that divide continues to be a divide. And it's not healthy to have that divide. It's not healthy to have people mistrustful of their national security.
It's not good, but I think you'd find in a democracy it's virtually universal.
Right.
The British, the Americans, the Australians all encounter the same thing. It may be that if you are a security organisation, you just have to grin and bear the fact that people will automatically assume you're lying and covering up and all those things that people will automatically assume on these sorts of things. It's just part of the burden of the thing, provided that you know and can demonstrate that you have always acted in accordance with the law. That's a crucial thing. I no doubt speak as the son of a lawyer, but I do think that in a democracy, if you step outside the law, you forfeit all regard and trust.
The law's one restraint, but ethics is another. And you talk about that moral obligation to help your brother in the case of the Second World War. And what we would imagine would be a moral obligation of the Americans to help us, even though they obviously have self-interest there as well.
Hello.
Do you think that there's a moral obligation or a demonstrable ethics that our intelligence agencies could demonstrate that would make people trust them more?
I certainly think there's an ethic obligation on all of them, all of us. How you demonstrate it, I don't know, because when you do try to demonstrate it, people say, you're lying, you're trying to fool us. So there's a limit to how far you can go. But the point is that in your own attitude and in the ethos of the organisation internally, you've got to make sure that this is fully understood. Because there's always a problem with these sorts of organisations of getting the wrong sort of person, not university, but 2 or 3 people who are not, who are prone to violence or shortcuts. And anyone who runs those organisations has to be very vigilant to make sure to head off that sort of person. It's a risk of the business that you will hire people who are violent and impatient, and you've got to make sure that it doesn't alter your ethos.
That's a good answer. So what did you hear in your early days of External Affairs about the Vegetable Club, about Paddy Costello and Ian Milne, Charles Brash? Were there rumours?
Well, all I heard was the absurdity of people like Dick Collins. It was at leisure. All I heard was gossip from people who were angry about the whole thing. You've got to remember the atmosphere at the time was very jumpy because the democracies were revealing that they had been, to some extent, been the victim of spying and so on. So there was an atmosphere of fear that, we're surrounded by people who are doing us bad, and that's never a good atmosphere. in which to take a cool look at things. We've seen that many times. And the Vegetable Club was the classic, but the only one that I know of where definitely it went way too far. I could not believe Dick Collins, I knew for years that he was a partner of my father's closest friend in law. The others, I think the Vegetable Club was a furphy, a panicky reaction to people perhaps saying, you know, what this government needs is a good kick in the pants, and those sort of things that aren't themselves subversive. Did we have spies? Yes, we did. I don't think there's any doubt about that. It's always been heavily questioned by people who say, oh yeah, the evidence isn't all in yet, and to some extent it isn't. There was some evidence on people like Paddy Costello that hasn't seen the light of day, but I think we have to accept that there were two or three people were indeed. Ian Milner I don't know anything about, because he was the Australians' problem. The fact that he ended his life in Prague, not a good look, I don't think, but I don't know anything about that. But Costello and such, certainly not Charles Brash, Costello and such, I think there's a case to be answered there very much.
When you say there's material that hasn't seen the light of day in Costello's case, do you mean that it's still in the files, or that we may never see that material?
I don't know. I don't hold it. I think we will know pretty certainly. There was a time when, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when their archives were pretty open and people got access to Bill Such's pay scales and all sorts of other things, were pretty damning. And there were other information that I think is still around on Costello. But there you are. It's not a big issue anymore.
Do you think that our intelligence agencies should write their own official histories?
You should write their
own official histories? In the way that, well, you know, not necessarily write their own, but they don't even have historians working in that I know.
No, it's almost, by definition, they're so anxious to preserve their files that you couldn't even have histories writing it up as they went along. I think an official history, provided it was done by, someone like yourself, if they wrote one in-house, it might be very good, but no one would believe it. So that's the whole problem with the intelligence agencies. People don't believe you when you do tell the truth. But yes, I think it would be interesting to know. But the SAS, like the British intelligence agencies 5 and 6, do not comment, even after years and years, on operations. And I think we probably raised in that tradition. So we've got to be pretty close-mouthed.
CIA has at least a working principle of a 25-year declassification. Should we have something like that?
Well, for all I know, we do. But it's not a classification problem. It's a problem of how much you really say out loud. And I suspect that, I don't know about the CIA. In America, leak is a form of release that is much more common than it is in our systems. So a lot of stuff that's controversial gets leaked. But fortunately, I think we don't do that. Because leaking is always for somebody's advantage or disadvantage. It's not a...
Can I interrupt? Two things. First thing is, I need to move your car.
Oh.
Because the guys cutting the hedge
Okay, yep.
are about to...
Oh, the hedge man's coming.
I think we're done. Thank you.